So here's our Chapter 4B answer key. So solve each equation below using any technique. List all solutions, including any imaginary solutions. Answers should be expressed exactly, so that means with either a square root or rounded to the nearest hundredth. And just reminder, hundredth is 2 places after the decimal. Recall that if, so there's reminding you of standard form, so the A and the B and the C, and then right here is our quadratic formula. So question 1. So looking at this, I only have an x squared. I don't have an x, and then I do have my constant, but when we don't have that x, that b number in the middle, we don't have to do the quadratic formula. This one is actually going to be easiest solved by just using a square root. So add 42 to both sides. 546 plus 42, and we get 588. Divide by 3. X squared is 196. And then to get rid of this square, we just have to square root on both sides. So the square root of 196 is 14. But remember, we do need to have the plus minus. And yes, you will lose points if you miss that, because you need to have 2 answers. And if you only have 14, well then you only have 1 answer. So really here, and you don't have to write this last part out, but this is why we need the we need the plus minus, is so that we have 2 answers. All right, so there's our first one. Our next one, very, very, very similar. So here, we also do not have an x term. We do not have a b number. So I'm going to solve this the exact same way I just did over there. I'm going to subtract 30. So 4x squared equals negative 20. I'm going to divide by 4. X squared equals negative 5, and square root both sides. So if you were to try and put this in your calculator right now, it's going to say error. It's going to say non-real answer. We do still need a plus minus out front, but what's unique, what's going on here, is we have this negative under the square root. So remember, a negative under the square root comes out, and it is an I. So this one, we are going to write as plus or minus I square root 5. If you choose to do the decimal, we could also write, and we're going to have to put just plain square root 5 in the calculator without the negative. You could write plus or minus 2.24 I. That would also be a correct answer here. Next up, question 3. Now this one, we do have a term in the middle. We have negative 6x. So that negative 6 is going to be my b. This one, we are going to want to use that quadratic formula up above. So I'm going to start with opposite b, so positive 6 plus or minus the square root of b squared. So 6 squared is 36, minus 4 times a is 2, times c is negative 9, all over 2 times a, and a is 2. All right, so then, like I've said, this highlighter's a lot darker. We want to put just the part under the square root into the calculator. So 36 minus, and then parentheses 4 times 2 times negative 9 is 108. So 6 plus or minus 108 all over 2 times 2 on the bottom is 4. So we have a positive number, so I'm going to have real answers, and it's not 0, so I'm going to have 2 answers. So we can put that square root 108 into the calculator and get a decimal. That's okay. So if I put this in my calculator by adding, so 6 plus the square root of 108, and then divide that by 4, I get 4.1. So I have 4.098, but when I round that, it rounds to 1, which to go to our 2 decimal places, I guess I would say 10 here. Now the same thing, but with the minus. So 6 minus the square root of 108. Divide that by 4, and I get negative 1 point, once again, 1. If you did not want to do a decimal, if you wanted to do a simplified square root, the 2 numbers that go into 108 are 36 and 3. So we would square root both of these. 6 plus or minus, the square root of 36 is 6, root 3 all over 4. Those are all even numbers, so even. So I'm going to take a 2 out of all of them. And this would be the simplified square root answer. So I am perfectly fine with the decimal answers, or the square root answers. Either one, I think the decimal is going to be a lot easier for most of you, but if you really like those simplified square roots, you can do the answer on the bottom. The last one here for these 4. So once again, we have all 3 terms. So once again, I'm going to do the quadratic formula. So opposite b is positive 10, plus or minus b squared is 100, and then 4 times a, remember if there's nothing out front, a is 1, times 34, all over 2 times 1, which is just going to be 2. So put the discriminant, if you remember that fancy word, into your calculator. And we get a negative number. 10 plus or minus the square root of negative 36, all over 2. So here, this negative becomes an I. And then we just take the square root of 36 as if there was no negative, which would be 6, all over 2. Because both the 10 and the 6 are even, I can divide them by 2, and then my final answer would be 5 plus or minus 3i. There's no decimal answer. This is the only correct answer for this one. So moving on to the word problems. The area of the given triangle is 60 feet squared. Set up an equation that can be used to find the value of x in the diagram below. Then solve for x. Recall that the area formula for a triangle is a equals 1/2 b times h, base times height. So we want to use this 1/2 base times height to write an equation. So they tell us the area. The area is 60. The 1/2 is just a 1/2. The base, if we look at our picture here, is x plus 5. and the height is x. So I'm going to need to multiply this right side all out. But before I do that, I want to get rid of this half. I don't like having a fraction with my x's. So to get rid of the half, I'm going to multiply both sides by the reciprocal, 2 over 1 times 2 over 1. So that cancels these out, and then 60 times 2 becomes 120. So now this is all gone. I'm just going to look at my x's. This x needs to get distributed into the parentheses. So x squared plus 5x. So now down here we've got an equation that's like what we've been working with. So I'm going to want to use the quadratic formula for this one, but before I can do that, this side on the left, this side needs to equal 0. So I'm going to subtract 120, and get 0 equals x squared plus 5x minus 120. Now I'm ready to use the quadratic formula. All right, so our quadratic formula, opposite b would be -5. B squared is 25. 4 times a times c all over 2 times a, which a is just 1. So put the discriminant, the part under the square root, into your calculator. So we've got 25 minus 4 times -120. And we get 505 with the square root still around it. So now I'm going to get my two answers. And because we're working with lengths, I am going to get decimal answers. I'm not going to deal with the simplified square roots. So -5 plus, so this answer is going to be my positive answer, my answer I get from adding the square root of 505, and then divide that by 2, 8.74. Same thing down below, -5 minus 505, and then divide that by 2, -13.74. So now, looking at our two answers, it does not make sense to have a length that is negative. So I'm going to go with this as my one and only answer. Okay, a couple more questions here. So here's our first page, moving on to the next page. While marching, a drum major tosses a baton into the air and catches it. The height, h, in feet of the baton after t seconds can be modeled by this equation. So we've seen this equation a few times, but they have it all already filled in for us. If the drum major catches the baton when it is 4 feet above the ground, find the number of seconds the baton was in the air. So she catches it when it was 4 feet above the ground, so that number is my h there. Because remember, h is the ending height. Oop. So 4 equals -16 t squared plus 32t plus 5. So to be able to do the quadratic formula, this side needs to equal 0. So I'm going to subtract that out of there. 0 plus 32 plus 1. All right, now my equation, my quadratic formula. Opposite b plus or minus b squared, so 32 squared is 1024 minus 4 times a times C all over 2 times A. All right, so now to put the part under the square roots into the calculator. And we get 1088. So negative 32 plus or minus the square root of 1088 all over negative 32. So let's do our positive answer, or our, it might not necessarily be positive, but the answer we get from adding and then the answer we get from subtracting. So negative 32 plus the square root of 1088 divided by negative 32. So for this one, I got negative 0.03 negative 32 minus the square root, and then divided by negative 32, I got 2.03. So this question was asking the number of seconds the baton was in the air. So it does not make sense to have negative seconds. So the correct answer is 2.03 seconds. Okay. Last question here. So first thing, there was an error on your green sheet, and it's fixed on this copy I've got here. But this originally said 45, and there's like a 90 floating off in the space over here. So just make sure you have 90 on that spot above the picture. All right. A park is going to add a fenced-in area for dogs to play. One side of the fence is going to use an existing fence. The other 3 sides are built using a total of 170 feet of fencing. The goal is to have the play area be 3,500 square feet. Write and solve an equation to find the width of the dog play area. So we have a rectangle. So reminder that the area of rectangles is base times height. So the area we want this play space to be, this play area, is 3,500. The base is on the bottom of the picture there, 170 minus 2x, and then the height is just x. Okay, so I'm going to distribute this x. And I'm also going to flip the order around so that my x squareds are first. So I multiplied both these numbers up above by x, but I also wanted to have my x squared be the first one in the order. We need the left side to be equal to 0, so I am going to subtract 3,500. And then I get 0 equals negative 2x squared plus 170 x minus 3,500. So we can put this into the quadratic equation right now, no problem, and we will get our correct answer. If you wanted to, you could simplify this a little by dividing everything by negative 2. So I know some of you would prefer to have nicer numbers. Some of you are okay using what we've got. Both are fine. Both are going to get you the correct answer. So I guess I will show it here if we divide out that negative 2. So then this becomes x squared 170 divided by negative 2 minus 85x plus 1750. So you can either use the first one as your A, B, and C, or this new one as your new A, B, and C. So if we go continue on with this new one, my B is negative 85, so opposite B is positive 85. plus or minus b squared. $7,225. So one benefit of dividing out that -2 is we already have some pretty big numbers, and so dividing it out just kind of keeps them a little bit smaller, keeps them a little manageable. So 4 times a times c all over 2a. We're going to put this part into our calculators. And we get 85 plus or minus the square root of 225 all over 2. So the answer I get from adding is 50. The answer I get from subtracting is 35. All right, so now we have two positive numbers. Which one are we going to pick? So if we think back to the picture, think back of what's going on, say I picked 50 as my answer. Well, that means that this base, 170 minus 2 times x, well, this would be 170 minus 100, it would be 70. If I picked 35, this would be 170 minus 70, this would be 100. Well, this part up here is only 90, so can this part down here be 100? If we think about it, this part down here has to be shorter, and so 70 is the only answer that makes sense, and so 50 is the answer that has to be x in our equation. So now, what are the dimensions? That just means what is the base and what is the height of the play area. Well, the base, like we said, if we plug in our x, we get 170 minus 100, which is 70. Our height, well, that's just our x. So our dimensions, we would say, are 50 by 70. Okay. So that last problem is a little bit harder, especially having to think about which answer is correct, because usually it's just the positive one. So make sure and kind of plug stuff back into the picture and see what you got. All right, good luck.